Okay, so again, I want to thank Van and Lisa for the opportunity to be able to share this information, which I hope and expect that it can be of real value to you in a very practical sense, because in my 40 years that actually graduated from the medical school at Columbia University in 1970, so it's been close to 50 years of being in this field, and I've seen so much evolution of understanding about the cause of chronic disease. And just to kind of make a long story short, stress has so much to do with health. And by learning and putting into practice some new understandings about how stress is created, we really have, I think, an advantage in terms of being able to be in relationships, be at work, and just our entire life experience can be on a higher level. And believing in God and being a Christian, certainly that's a source of tremendous empowerment on every level. And yet it seems that a great many people, no matter what their religious affiliation or lack of it, deal with the issue of stress and how to kind of manage it. So what I'd like to do is present a few of these slides and then give you the opportunity to be able to ask some questions, and maybe we can have a little dialogue about that. There's what we call the conventional view of stress. And this is, if you look in the dictionary, it talks about a state of strain and tension, anxiety, depression, confusion resulting from adverse or very demanding circumstances. That's the formal definition. In other words, stress is being caused by the situation out there. The circumstances cause our stress. That's the conventional view. The problem with this is, with that kind of view, is that we tend to focus, therefore, on how we can change the circumstances, how we can change the situations that are causing us our stress. And this is kind of like, if we look at an iceberg, we see the part that's above the water, but the vast portion of the iceberg is actually invisible to us. And so when we focus on kind of the circumstances, that's the thing that's sort of really visible to us, the situations at work or a relationship or whatever it might be. We focus on that because that's right in our face, so to speak. It's what we can clearly see. But the problem with that model, just like in an iceberg, is that there's something below the surface, and that's what I want to introduce some ideas for you to consider in terms of what really is the root cause of stress. The conventional view almost has it that there's sort of stress particles that exist around certain situations, like working in a trauma center, as opposed to a peaceful mountain countryside where there's very few stress particles. That's the kind of conventional view, that stress particles in people, events, and circumstances, they're causing our stress. So if we want to have less stress, we kind of have to avoid those people or avoid those environments, or you can see where that kind of thinking goes. But more and more there's an appreciation as the field of stress management has evolved. There's a distinction now between the stressors, which are the things in the environment, in the circumstances that we face, that potentially activate a stress response within us. So the actual stress is a response within us to something that's happening outside. which is the stressor. But even this more empowering view of stress, which is saying, well, it's kind of not really what's outside, it's what's being triggered from outside, but it's still a response within us. Even this misses a key point, a key factor, which is the process between the impact of the stressor, meaning that difficult person that you have to deal with, or that deadline that's upon you, that's provoking this kind of reaction, and our actual experience or awareness. There's something going on between the stressor and the stress response. And that's what we want to talk about today. So, as a result of the conventional view of stress relief, there's essentially two things that you can do. You either avoid the circumstances, leave that trauma center and find yourself a mountaintop to live at, or, find a different job or a different partner, different relationships, or you change what's going on out there. You change the situation. That's one way of handling it based on the conventional view. Or the second, which is more kind of coming into more and more prominence, is that you manage the stress. It's an issue of stress management. And the leading methodologies for managing stress is to think differently about the stressor, what's called reframing or cognitive behavioral kind of approach, or by releasing stress with stress management techniques like exercise or various other things that you might do to be able to relieve the stress, release the stress. The last time we talked about shifting to a state of gratitude through the systems such as HeartMath that really bring about a shift in the experience of stress by using the power of gratitude. But what I'm going to talk about today is a much more leading edge and much more advanced view. And this is why I'm really excited to be able to share this with people and with organizations, because this, I believe, is kind of the leading edge. It's to eliminate the creation of stress, to actually eliminate it, not manage it, not avoid it, not change the outside circumstances, but literally eliminate the creation of stress. And this particular author, Joyce Meyer, she has had a real impact, because before I became aware of what I want to share with you today, I was very much interested in this kind of approach. For example, in her book, Battlefield of the Mind, she said that the biggest problems we face in life often result from wrong thinking. And like her books will talk about the impact of wrong thinking and why we need to have the right kind of thinking. So this approach is kind of like to change thinking from the kind that causes stress to the kind of thinking that will be empowering. But I'm happy to say that, and this is a quote from, again, from Joyce Meyer. She's talking about receiving through our faith a new spirit and a new heart from God, but we don't receive a new mind. The mind must be renewed. And so if we focus on what the latest views are in the psychological field because the psychological side of health has really been kind of separated from the physical side of health. But now with the whole paradigm of integration, where everything is really being understood as coming together, the spirit, the mind, and the body. That's the more advanced view of the human system, spirit, mind, and body. how our mind works. The latest insights about how our mind works are of tremendous value to us potentially. How our mind works as a psychological system in health and in disease. And the results of this kind of understanding are now being reflected in peer-reviewed articles in leading psychological journals. And what it comes down to is that we know so much about the physical systems of the body. We know so much about the immune system and the cardiovascular system and the digestive system and the endocrine system and on and on and on. We know so much about these systems within our body. But the psychological system that is operating all the time in our mind, the psychological system, we actually have very little idea about it because it doesn't lend itself to the kind of research that occurs when you're studying something which is physical, like the cardiovascular system. So we become largely unaware of how our psychological system functions. We have great faith, and hopefully we have a healthy body, but we still don't really know about how our psychological system functions. And what's being understood more and more now in this kind of field of health psychology is that it's based on principles, just like an airplane defies gravity based on principles of aerodynamics. There are principles that govern the way our psychological system functions, and this is what I want to introduce to you. So you might recall, I don't know, in high school chemistry or whatever, the periodic chart of the elements. This is saying that every physical thing ultimately is built upon certain physical elements. Hydrogen, oxygen, whatever the element. And those elements make compounds. And those compounds then lead to bigger and bigger entities. Well, in a similar kind of way on the psychological level, there are three elements. Now this is just a model. We may, as time goes on, we may have a different understanding. This is a model that's coming out of, again, the leading edge of health psychology, that there are three elements operating in our mind and psychological system: thought, feeling, and awareness or consciousness. Now these may mean, as you look at the slide or hear me speak, you may already have in your mind a definition of what these things are. And I can tell you there are many, many definitions for all of these things. So what I want to say is that I'm talking about thought as the process of having ideas, concepts, beliefs, sometimes unconscious, but operating unconsciously or consciously. And then there's feeling. Feeling is an emotional response, and you feel it even throughout your body as a physical sensation. That's feelings. And then there's the awareness or consciousness, which is your awareness of what it is that you're feeling. And these are three different dynamics that can't truly be separated because it's all working together as one psychological system, just like the psychological system is also integrated with the physical system and even with the spiritual reality. Because there's only really one dynamic going on in a human being. But for the sake of trying to understand how we can really how we can get a handle on stress relief, we kind of have these different elements. So one of the most basic things that I want to share with you today is the fact that the cause of our feelings are our thoughts. You really cannot have a thought without it getting expressed as a feeling, and you can't have a feeling without there being a preceding thought. In fact, thoughts and feelings are really, again, it's like it's one thing, but there's the thought and then the feeling. You can't have a thought without in the body there being a feeling. Every feeling is a direct result of thought. Now, this is a key point here. This is a key point. We cannot experience the outside world, those circumstances, that situation at work, that situation at home, whatever it is, we can't really experience the circumstances of our world. We can't experience it directly, but only through our nervous system that's interpreting the information that it's receiving. Now this is a key point, and it's going to be the understanding of this point can lead to a whole different experience with regarding stressors or those things in our life that are theoretically or potentially provoking our stress. This is a little diagram that I was aware of this, I think, in high school. I wanted to, originally, before I got interested in holistic and integrative medicine, I wanted to be an eye surgeon, and I made models of the eye in high school, and also I was intrigued with how the eye functions. Well, here's in the outside world a flower. There's a flower, okay? Now, the sensory, the energy is picked up by the eye, and through a very complex process, there's an image of the flower on the back of the eye called the retina. The image is actually upside down. So even in the back of the eye, you're no longer looking at the actual thing outside in the environment. Now, in the back of the eye is an inverted image, which then, through the optic nerve, goes into the brain, where who knows how many processes work on that image so that eventually we see projected an image of this original thing out there. Now, why is this so important? Because what I said in the slide before is that we can't really experience the flower or anything outside of ourself without it going through an incredibly complex neurological process that takes the information and puts it through, as I said, a very dynamic and very complex process to give us an experience of thought and feeling. And that's what we're aware of. That's what we're conscious of. So the implications of this are enormous because, and this is a very, a relatively early book on research on the connection between thoughts and emotions and what's called the molecules of emotion. Talking about molecules of emotion are like photocopies of thought. So again, the link between thought and feeling. So as a kind of summary of where we've come to this point, stress is our thinking creating a feeling of tension. As soon as you have a thought, you're going to have a feeling. And if you don't think your stress is caused by your thoughts, you're going to think they're caused by events, circumstances, and people. You will believe that it's out there as you're perceiving it that's causing you the stress, rather than an entirely internal process. Now, if you become aware, for example, why aren't we afraid of our own shouting? I mean, if you go and you scream at the top of your lungs, why don't you get afraid of that? The way you might if it was someone else. Because if you're doing the shouting, you realize you're doing the shouting, how can you be afraid of it? Likewise, it's very difficult, hard to remember that we're the ones doing the thinking about what is actually happening, because it all seems so real, because it's made real by our thought becoming feeling and expressed through our emotional experience. We could be complaining about a headache, but we wouldn't do it if we realized that we're banging our head against the wall. That's what's causing the headache. If we become aware that we're causing it, the headache's being caused by our own self, we're not going to necessarily, well, then just stop doing it. So most of our thoughts that lead to feelings and lead to an experience are like static on a television. If you really observe, and no one can really do this fully, but if you observe a lot of your thinking, even most of your thinking, you have to draw the conclusion that it's sort of like a lot of static on a TV. You know, all the internal dialogue that we have, particularly, liking this, not liking that, evaluating, judging, all of that is like static. And if we're feeling stress, and then we rely on an analysis of our own thinking, we only make the situation more difficult. What's actually much better is to not identify with that thinking, not identify with those thoughts and the feelings, but rather just let them pass through. Because whether thoughts are positive or negative, it's still just a function of our own life. So it's not us. A lot of our thinking we take seriously because we identify it with it as being us, as opposed to something that is just happening through us. Thoughts are just simply thoughts. That's why trying to control thoughts is like trying to control the static on a TV. It's not going to make any difference because it's not really what matters. Letting the thoughts flow without identifying with them will allow, hopefully, newer thoughts to come. And what kind of thoughts do we want to have? We want to have wisdom. We want to have true thoughts. This is where our connection through our faith, with the source of truth, with the source of wisdom, the whole meaning of renewing our mind comes in, that we can allow most of what is going through our daily experience of thinking and feeling as just let it pass through, not identify with it, not analyze it, not even really think about it. In fact, most of the thinking about what's happening is really just overthinking and creating even more stress. So, stressed out feelings that we all have, no matter who we are, we can have experiences that as a result of the way that we're thinking about it, generate stress. We can look at it as a built-in mechanism for assessing our state of mind and the quality of our thinking. If we're under stress, in the conventional view, we want to avoid the situation out there or we want to change it. In this view of stress, it's telling us the quality of our thinking and the degree to which we're caught up in our own thinking. So we want to back away from it and make room for wisdom, God's wisdom to come in, and to be able to experience something other than we'd be experiencing by taking our thinking seriously and identifying with it. Thinking about, the source of wisdom, we can say God is the source of wisdom, is like the sun. And most of our thinking is like the clouds. Sometimes the weather gets really intense. And we feel, and we have an experience of a lot of turmoil and a lot of stress and a lot of agitation or a lot of anxiety. But it's really the weather. It's just like the weather. It will pass. The more we can let it move, let it flow, so that the wisdom from the sun, so to speak, that's what we can take in. Instead of being upset with the person, for example, we feel compassion for the person. Oh, gee, they may have had a really rough time at home, or maybe there's some child that's sick, there could be a thousand ways that we in wisdom would relate to the outside circumstances. This is a book, one of my favorites, Living by Design, by a medical doctor in the integrative field, and Bill Elling, who is, I guess, a very well-known evangelical leader. And in their book, Living by Design, they say you were designed by God to experience stress when you try to live by self-effort. Again, self-effort, paying attention to your thought, thinking, identifying with your own thinking. Recurring or chronic stress can be like the warning light on the dashboard of your car indicating that you are not living according to design, which means, again, the renewal of the mind so that the wisdom can really be what is influencing us. So, in conclusion, this kind of approach, it has so many practical implications and applications in terms of relationships, in terms of challenges at work, whatever deadlines, workloads, unwanted habits, because all of these things, while we might tend to think, and we've been brought up, and sort of the whole culture tries to tell us it's all based on factors beyond our control, in reality, this is all, we can come to the point through deeper understanding to realize that we are in a position to be able to experience, even, as I say with the analogy of weather, very tumultuous weather, but be in a place of peace, a place of resiliency, where we are just not reacting, but are really creating our experience irrespective of the circumstances.